Good afternoon, and I think you guys probably had sort of the main attraction this morning. So we're like the folks trying to, at least keep your attention for a couple minutes. But, I listened to all the conversations this morning, and I think there's so much that was said. And frankly, I think my presentation was given many times over. And the one thing I would like to say before even getting started was just a huge thanks to Tiffany. I think you just did an incredible job. When Tiffany's called about a month ago and said, I'm thinking about doing this, I was expecting, the last time I was here, I think we had a room which was a really engaging conversation led by Mayor Berger. I think we had about maybe 45, so I was expecting maybe 50 this time. Tiffany, you've outdone yourself. Great job. Let's give her applause, please. This is great. I also want to thank Mayor Berger and the team in Ohio for putting this conversation together. Lauren will mention this briefly, but I think part of our responsibility with the new bill is to really go out and talk across the country, frankly, primarily, obviously, in sort of, Northeast and the Midwest and elsewhere where we have integrated plans as an option. But this is an exercise that Congress charged the agency to focus on, making sure that we are not only letting communities that are interested in incorporating an integrated plan in their permits, but also in their consent decree. And so Lauren will talk a bit about the consent decree and how we're thinking about pursuing that process. I want to reflect a little bit on some of the conversations that happened earlier this morning, because I think, and to the conversation related to just some of the best practices, if you will, or some of the things that we can learn or from some of the integrated plans that are in place. I think there are really a lot of neat stuff that people talked about. I didn't realize Kyle was this funny, by the way. So Kyle and I have been on a lot of panels together, and I don't know, maybe because you're home, but I'm like, I don't remember Kyle being this funny. So one of the things I learned in terms of best practice for integrated plan, you gotta be funny. So that's a Kyle one. Let's go with Kyle. But issues around timing, I think, is really important. That's a point that I think was made several times. These things are not gonna happen overnight, so we really need to think about making sure we're methodically strategically planning next steps. So that's really critical. Collaboration. So much of the projects that we fund, whether it's funding or through permitting, we have to collaborate with other agencies, with other stakeholders. And so I think that was a really important recommendation. And I think just about everyone that presented this morning had the issue of collaboration or collaborative thinking as a sort of a critical item. Patience, obviously, is one that I think we will continue to sort of highlight. Kyle talked a little bit about, just the different processes that are involved. I think when you write a legislation or there is a new rule for us to implement, oftentimes, and it's very interesting, you could have seven people looking at the same thing in front of you, and they all have 7 different interpretations of how it should be deployed or how we should implement it. So there's got to be the process of making sure we are thoroughly and methodically and getting it right. So patience, I think, will always be crucial. One of the things from integrated planning, when we sort of put the integrated planning as sort of a concept several years ago, 2012, actually before 2012, ultimately it was put in place in 2012. One of the ideas there was this issue of efficiency. So you heard a lot about that this morning, but I think one of the benefits that have accrued to communities across the country that have employed integrated plan as sort of an option to manage their water and wastewater obligation is this idea of multi-narrative, if you will, or multiple benefits. And I think if we implement integrated planning the way we have conceived of it, the way we have collectively conceived of it, because it's not just an EPA item, it's an item that I think communities across the country has helped us to develop, is this idea of multiple benefits. So for some of you who are thinking about potentially pursuing an integrated plan, think about the benefits that are accruing not only to your water and wastewater systems, but also the economic development. Mayor Summers talked a little bit this morning about where he had a landfill, and when you looked at that picture, it's no longer a landfill. It's a space, if you will, where the community gets together. And I've seen this across the country where between the concept of integrated planning or stormwater planning, we have seen so many communities have been transformed in terms of the economic development that has accrued from some of these projects. So I think that's also a critical one. Finally, I want to mention this because I think it has been mentioned briefly, but I think it's really important for us, particularly me from the agency, to emphasize the issue of water quality standards and making sure that we're meeting whether it's the spirit or the intent of the Clean Water Act, that we have to address critical issues around water quality standards, but perhaps more importantly for many of you, the designated uses. More often than not, you have the 5 designated uses, recreational criteria being one. So as we contemplate doing these critical things, we think about the benefits that are accruing to the community. We also have to think and have to place very high on the list the benefits that will accrue to the environment, because that's essential. That's why we are actually doing this in many circumstances. But I think the other benefits are perhaps equally important, especially when you think about how we can use this environmental enterprise that we're all engaged in to help advance some of the issues within our local communities, particularly economic development. So I want to touch on about 4 issues very quickly. Tiffany gave me 15 minutes, and I told Tiffany that might not actually work because I love to talk, but I'm going to try and get it down to 15 minutes, and hopefully we can have some questions. First one, and I think Judy did a really good job this morning covering the integrated planning bill. Again, a big thanks to many of your mayors here in Ohio, particularly Mayor Berger and others who helped with the passage of this. Several years ago, before 2012, I think we had so many issues across the country, people trying to figure out ways to address their water and wastewater obligations and the competing demands, if you will. And ultimately, that led us through just a series of conversations, and ultimately we developed the integrated plan. And so January 18th of this year, the president signed the bill. And so what was a sort of a guidance that we issued almost 7-8 years ago is now a regulatory instrument that you can use to address your water and wastewater obligations. So one of the key things in there, and I think we have talked a bit about this, and perhaps it's one of the reasons why many of the city managers and mayors are here, is that you can actually incorporate or utilize that integrated plan and incorporate it into your permit or into a consent decree. And there's some key items there. Judy talked a little bit about the issue of water quality standards being important. And it's important in the context that if you're doing an integrated plan, chances are it's going to be more than 5 years. But the state water quality standards must actually sort of commensurately support a term beyond 5 years. If it's going to be integrated into the enforcement transaction, then we need to talk a little bit with our OECA team, and Tiffany talked a lot about also engaging DOJ. But the thing that I want to make sure that everyone is fully aware of, and maybe the biggest reason, and Mayor Berger had some ideas about what he thinks, how will this be successful in? For Mayor Berger, he says 10 communities essentially adopt an integrated plan. I actually think the idea of at least one other community today, so I'm not saying 10, Mayor Berger, I'm going to go with one other community in this room that has not done integrated plan. If you leave here today and you decide this is how I would like to pursue an integrated plan going forward, I think that would be success, because that's part of our job under this new instrument, to provide as much information as possible, talk about the benefits that will accrue to the community, to the environment, and hopefully we can get folks to be engaged. And the agency, both headquarters and the regions, all 10 regions, are very much on board with the concept of integrated plan. About a week and a half ago, it's a little bit more than a week and a half ago, our team, myself, by the way, let me stop and acknowledge our team within the Office of Wastewater Management. Many of you probably know Chris Gloss. Can you stand up quickly, Chris? He doesn't like that, but please stand up. So Chris is the person you will likely have a lot of conversations with about integrated planning. His branch manages all our stormwater obligations. Sally, please stand. Sally's home is how far from here, Sally? A few miles down the street. And I borrowed Sally from Cincinnati about 16 months ago. to be the acting division director in our shop. And then Robin Young is also on our staff, and Robin is playing a key role. But as we think about how our implementation efforts are going to be moving forward, that's the team that's going to be working on this. But going back to the conversation we had a few weeks ago with the administrator, we talked about implementing the integrated plan, the integrated planning legislation. I think as Mayor Berger and others quite often remind me, so what exactly are you doing? The president signed this close to a year ago. Why aren't you moving faster? We have been moving. We have actually been collecting a lot of information. We have a report to Congress to produce. But more importantly, we have been thinking about this Office of the Ombudsman. And I think the Office of the Ombudsman in particular, was very important to the mayors. They wanted to have a person who essentially is a liaison between EPA and the communities that are thinking about pushing integrated planning forward. And so over the last several months, we have been sort of conceptualizing how this will happen. We met with the administrator, got the okay. At this point in time, we're actually going to hire an interim ombudsman because I want to ultimately hire, and we're going to do sort of a concurrent hiring process where we'll hire a permanent ombudsman. My hope is that the permanent ombudsman will be someone who is very familiar with how cities work. Ideally, this might be someone who doesn't work for EPA currently, but someone who understands how cities work, how cities operate, and understand the legislation, understand how EPA also works. So we're going to be, hopefully, an EPA hiring just doesn't happen quickly. And so, but my hope is that we'll be able to get this out sometime soon and recruit. It could end up being someone in the agency, but again, just understanding exactly what was behind the thinking when the mayors helped to formulate this legislation. I think it's going to be really important for the agency to think long and hard about finding someone outside of the agency to be the ombudsman. And so the ombudsman office will be supported by someone on my shop, in Chris's office. Robin probably will be the initial point person. There's going to be someone from the Office of in OECA, or Compliance and Enforcement Office. And so these internal staff will support the ombudsman in meeting, I think, the obligations that we talked about earlier. So they will have to provide financial assistance information, technical assistance information, the flexibilities that are allowed currently under the regulation. And I think the last point Judy talked about earlier this morning, which I think is critical, is just sharing information. So whether it's on a website or different websites, or pointing people to different resources, the ombudsman will have sort of a full suite of activities within their portfolio as soon as they join. Hopefully, they'll join the agency fairly soon. The next issue I want to touch on, and I heard quite a bit about it throughout this morning, is the issue of affordability. I think, and I heard direct reference to the issue of 2%, and so I want to touch on the 2% issue immediately. And I think we tried to do this in 2012, and if for some reason we didn't do it, I was, partially involved in crafting that 2012 guidance. They started it before I got there. And so we must have failed because we might not have gotten the language correct, but 2%, especially in 2012, was not the only indicator. And I think we tried to expand the 2012 framework and 2014 framework, really expanded the list of indicators that any muni could potentially use to address affordability. So there's a bunch of factors. You have sort of a two-stage process, the residential process, and then you have sort of a system-wide community process. 2% was one of many. It was never meant to be the primary and the sole indicator of measuring affordability. And frankly, I don't think it actually measures affordability. More often than not, it talks about the issue of ability to pay. But nevertheless, I think there's a fair amount of confusion around the role of 2%. And so we have acknowledged, we understand, and so we have an active process undergoing within the agency where we will be crafting a new affordability framework. I'm not particularly positive about what the timing will be, but what I've asked my team internally is to have a draft for us sometime late fall this year. And ultimately, we will be putting this document in the Federal Register and asking for your input. And so there are a couple of ideas that have sort of confluenced our collective thinking around this. NAQA, Chris Hornback, who is sitting here, was instrumental in this, but also AWWA and WEF. And they put together a document that touched on, obviously, some of the concerns or some of the limitations associated with the agency's plan, if you will, and how 2% continued to play a significant role. And so there was a critique, or there was a thought that 2% should not, or 2%, there are some issues with 2%, and we need to think about other potential metrics that could help to better understand the issue of affordability, or better predict, or better help with the issue of schedule. And so as we walk through that process, I think where we have landed is we really need to think about the broader community's ability to pay. So we have to think, if you're a community of 1,500, we have to look collectively at the broad community. What is the ability of the 1,500, the community's entirety, their ability to pay? But I think Mayor Sommers touched on this also, this importance of the lowest quintile, if you will. And when I say the lowest quintile, the quintile, or the group of community folks who are having a really difficult time meeting their water and wastewater obligation. And Kyle touched on this. When you look at sort of the broader obligations, you have sewage, you have electricity, you have many different utility bills that many community folks are responsible for. And you have one payer, or two rate payers, if you will, within the home. So how do we get to the single rate payer and all these obligations? And so our effort will likely take a closer look at the broader community, and we will also focus on those most in need. And the idea there, hopefully we will develop a new screening system, if you will, a new set of metric that will better capture the ability of the whole community to pay. This idea of, you have extremes. Yes, you do have extremes, and you have a few in the middle, but I think we really want to make sure we get to the folks at the bottom of those extremes. And so my hope is we can sort of craft a document, craft a framework, which we will put out for public consideration, and you could provide feedback to us to see if we actually got it. I think we are close to a sweet spot, but then, there are a lot of things I think we're very close to, and we never end up getting there. But this one, I actually feel pretty confident that we might have an idea in place. You'll hear more from the team later, and they might disagree with me full some, but that's okay. I'm comfortable with Chris disagreeing with me. The third issue I want to touch on a little bit, and I think the mayor of Akron spoke to this earlier today, is this issue of how we finance our projects. And Jerry, who is a good friend of mine, we spent a lot of time meeting with the states across the country, talking about their how they finance their program. So in my office, I oversee the NPDES program for the country, but I also oversee most of the main financial programs within EPA. So the Clean Water SRF is one. I also oversee the WIFIA program, but specifically the Clean Water SRF. Jerry is sort of a trailblazer, actually. So one of the things Jerry did about 5 years ago, Jerry came to the agency and he said, listen, the 20-year mechanism within the Clean Water Act to finance these projects, it's not working for my communities in Ohio. How can you help us? And Jerry proceeded to make this really compelling case where he said, you need to look at the useful life of the assets, and in this case, the water and sewer assets. And so we went off and we did an analysis and essentially agreed with Jerry, and we signed an agreement, and the state of Ohio is one of two in the country, and a lot of folks are now asking us to if we could provide the information that Ohio provided. But what Ohio did sort of got a waiver, if you will, something a little different than what the rest of the states are doing. You can now fund a Clean Water SRF project. The tenor, if you will, or the time frame to actually repay the loan is 45 years. The standard at the time when Jerry got the break was 20 years. Congress has since amended the Clean Water Act to make that repayment period 30 years. But because of the work Jerry did, many other states are now thinking of expanding and extending the time to repay the loan. The critical consideration there is the useful life of the asset. And I think there are several people who talked today about water and wastewater assets being way more than 30 years. And I think the mayor from Akron, actually, he's on to something, but also we got to really think about, the perpetuity of the fund. But the idea of more than one generation actually accepting or assuming some of the repayment obligations, I think it's actually something worth thinking about, because you're essentially building an asset on the back of your current consumers. Why not think, again, this is just an innovative way to pay for your assets going forward. And there are other communities that are looking at, Indiana actually is the other state that just extended their useful life beyond 30 years. They have a 35-year regime in place that they're contemplating. So let me stop there, and again, I'd be happy to take questions on just about everything that you discussed this morning, but I really want to, again, thank the Mayor's Alliance, thank Tiffany for this conversation. Our hope is that we're going to be having this conversation across the country, but I gained so much this morning sort of listening to not just the mayors, but to the utility owners and the system operators. The final point I will make, and I'm not sure who discussed this morning, but one of the things that we really have to think very hard about going forward is the workforce. I think the workforce is such a critical part of what the infrastructure footprint will look like. One of the things we're struggling with, I think, nationally, even at EPA, when you look at the retirement profile, it's incredible. I think EPA could potentially lose a significant part of the workforce in 30 to 40% in the next 5 to 10 years. But the institutional knowledge that potentially could be lost is pretty significant. And how do we actually train people to make sure they're ready to adopt and address the concerns going forward? So that's a really important issue for us to think about. This idea of the utility of the future, and we're thinking about new technologies, and I think just about everyone in the room talk about the importance of technology in solving some of our issues. Many of these folks are not trained to address the technological needs that will be important, will be essential to what the utility of the future looks like, or to what the community of the future looks like. And so we really have to start thinking very long and hard about how we strategically build a new workforce that will address the many obligations. So hopefully I did just about 16 minutes, Tiffany, but thank you so much. And Lauren, can you come on up and talk a little bit about some of the enforcement ideas at EPA?
But I've worked for EPA for about 22 years, started in Region 5, and been doing water issues since 2007. So I think I've visited some of the communities in Ohio. Some of you may remember me as an inspector many years ago. So I also just want to make sure you guys know I'm not a lawyer. I come from a law shop, I guess. I manage a lot of lawyers, but I'm an engineer by training. And so I think that's useful, hopefully, for the discussions that we have with the various folks in the room, because I have a lot of lawyers on my staff that are involved in discussions and negotiations with municipalities and others, and I can kind of, Judy said, play a lawyer by day. I kind of play that by day as well, but I have my attorneys to actually tell me when I'm screwing it up, and then we have a lot of engineers that tell me when I'm screwing those things up as well. I also, just a quick plug for my level of preparedness for today, or lack thereof. Monday, I've been working on a PhD for, part-time for years and years and years. So I had my dissertation defense on Monday. It was a very stressful day, and I passed, and they called me Dr. Denton. So I don't think it's official. It's not official yet. Well, it's not official yet, maybe at George Washington University, but it's in engineering management. So that was a panel of 5. I felt nervous. Now I have a much larger panel, and I feel equally nervous. So one of the things I just want to talk about is, we've been obviously working, we had a national compliance initiative, the CSO SSO, National Municipal Compliance Initiative, for many, many years. And that's really what led to enforcement, certainly headquarters involvement, but I think it also was a lot why the regional involvement with doing this kind of work came about. I just want you guys to know that initiative Yesterday was the last day of that initiative. So it's wrapped up. And so some of you are going to be looking at me like, what do you mean that's wrapped up? Because I have a 20+ year consent decree. Yeah, we're trying to figure out what that means too, because this work is obviously ongoing. But I think what it means is we think that we have a path. I couldn't even tell you what it means for the short term. How is our web page going to look? So we're still, I'm not on that team that does the web page, but we're going to have to try and figure out what that means. And then in its place, because my branch, so I, handle all drinking water issues plus basically Municipal Clean Water Act enforcement issues. There's going to be a new drinking water national compliance initiative. So that may impact some of you. That started today. So I think, what I anticipated and what we're trying to do is we're basically trying to make sure that there's resources in place and acknowledgement for our hardworking folks in the region and all the work that they do and working with municipalities, whether that be CD implementation, consent decree implementation, when you come in for modification requests under integrated planning, which we anticipate is going to happen more and more, and which we're fine with, by the way. So I just want you to know that we are working to figure out how to make all of, that's something that we're continuing to be engaged on. Okay, I'm going to use a word that probably it's just because I'm going to Greece later this year, mythology. Okay, I've heard a lot of things today because people talk over a long time as though that's today. And so I just want to acknowledge that even though mythology, I think maybe there's a basis in truth, like there probably are some God quality or goddess qualities that represent some of these various elements. I mean, there's basis in truth. I don't know if it's what's true or not true. This is part of my spiritual element. This is not part of the PhD. But the mythology part I just want to say is, like for instance, green infrastructure. I remember when Chris Kloss came to my office before he worked for EPA, trying to sell me on green infrastructure, and I was like, this is not going to work. We need tunnels. We need tanks, And we would go, and so eventually, Chris, Nancy Stoner, others, I started seeing the benefits. I'm a believer. I just want you to know, I'm a believer that green infrastructure works, but from a mythology standpoint, you might have someone tell you about, well, I talked to EPA in 2010 and they said it's not going to work. Well, maybe I did. But today, I'm a believer. So, but we have to figure out how to make it work with gray infrastructure. Region 5, problem region. I'm talking mythology, and I guess I'm being taped. So that probably in today's short sound bites, that's going to be like, cut, and that's all that's going to be on there. Sorry, Region 5. So, we've been working very closely with Region 5, very closely. And I think there's really, I think maybe historically there were some issues between our communication with other regions. I meet on at least monthly basis with the Region 5 management and all of the regional management. I have people from my branch are on every large CSO, SSO case in the country. So if you are meeting with Region 5 and you're a large community, and that's basically about 50,000 people or more, it's not a bright line, there's a very good chance that someone from my office is on that team. So I just want you to know that we are trying to work on national consistency and make sure that happens. Integrated planning. I know I met a lot of you guys doing integrated planning discussions. I was part of the road show. I don't think, I didn't get the title groupie like some of you got pointing out. But I was there, and I was one of the small team at EPA that helped develop it, and I've always been a supporter of it. So to me, I'm very excited that this is part, that this got incorporated into the Clean Water Act, and there's support for it, and I'm a big believer in it. And I think it was Kyle who said it. This is frankly just good, a good way to run your system. I've seen all sorts of integrated plans, and what it comes down to is like those communities that aren't really kind of going out and making sure they know what's going on. They don't have an integrated plan, but they basically aren't doing their job of knowing what's going on. And so, to me, integrated planning, it is somewhat analogous to developing a CSO LTCP, by the way. If you think about alternatives analysis and thinking about all the things that, what works, what doesn't, how should we integrate these, what is the cost? It could be like that. I'm not saying that it is like that. If some of your consultants are starting to get out your calculators and, how can we? It can also be very simple. It's basically, how do I start knowing where my infrastructure is, knowing where my problems are, and looking to how to tackle that. Okay, so I mentioned Region 5 that I think we have a very good relationship. I also just want to say that it's not just Region 5. I mean, my office works consistently with Department of Justice. I know Tiffany asked me to talk about the relationship with Department of Justice. We work closely with many state offices, with the utilities themselves. I mean, I've met a very significant number of you in this room. So, I think that, we're available to talk. We're concerned about national consistency, but at the same time, we know, and as you've heard from the speakers that have been up this morning, these communities have different issues. There's different things going on. There's different, geography. There's different water issues. They're going to different places. And so we have to try and figure out how do we take our national consistency issues and merge that with, what's going on in your community. And then, to be honest, maybe it's because I'm enforcement or whatever, I also am but that we also have to, it's not just for cherry picking from, hey, well, that's what Cincinnati did, so we want to do that in, city A or whatever. I mean, it's well, Cincinnati maybe had some very specific reasons why we agreed to something. So I think you guys just have to know when we have these enforcement discussions, especially for modification, I mean, we want you to come to the table prepared so that we can have a good discussion. But they're complicated. It's complicated to get to multi-million-dollar settlements. It takes a long time. It requires technical people, policymakers, lawyers. That's how you get the settlement. And so if you come to us and want to change the settlement, I mean, we're willing to and want to work with you, but just know that we want to make sure, how does this impact the balance of the whole agreement? So that's what we're looking at. So in terms of integrated planning, I agree with I don't know that we've really reiterated it, but that 2012 framework document, I mean, I think it's very well said in terms of it needs to maintain regulatory standards. We see, and I have people basically say, this means I have to do less. It does not necessarily mean you need to do less. It means we need to prioritize and figure out how to do the most important things first. We're interested in looking at your schedule. How can we address those most worst-case scenarios first? It's really up to the municipality to develop the integrated plan. The more work you put into it and kind of keeping the agency and the state involved as you're doing that, I think the better, so that it's not a surprise the state regulator or EPA gets this 200-page document and they didn't even know it was coming. That's not good. Tell the state and EPA that you're doing it and that you're anticipating that you have some modification issue in a consent decree down the road that you might want to address. So we know it's coming, and there's discussions already happening. If integrated planning involves other parties, let's make sure those parties know about that they are part of the integrated plan and the discussion. There needs to be regulatory, reasons, or is it required by a permit or a consent decree somewhere else? I mean, what are we bringing in? It can't just be based on hypotheticals. We think we're going to have to fix something 10 years from now, or we think the rule is going to change. I mean, we have modifications provisions if those types of things happen. But if we know something's going to happen, then let's just acknowledge that in the document. And by the way, I shouldn't say it can't or it can't. I mean, there's always flexibility. We have to figure out, it's going to be case by case. We have to figure it out as we're talking about this. Flexibility, I keep hearing about that. I mean, I think we at EPA, and again, this is maybe back to my mythology. Again, don't be mad by me saying mythology, because I'm not pointing the finger at anyone, but it's just well, now I am. We have not historically been very flexible in our consent decrees. There are probably still some older consent decrees that don't have the kind of flexibility that I would want to see today. So I'm interested in the flexibility, but we're still trying to figure out how to, we need to have sufficient level of oversight in the consent decree to ensure that the projects happen. Because we've also seen the consent decrees where they were very flexible, and after 10 or 15 years, they're just not even close to being done. So there has to be enough oversight that we can ensure the water quality standards are being met, but yet give you, the city, the ability to do it. All right, so you mentioned, Tiffany, that I have a list of the universe of CDs. You probably made fun of me, I wasn't here, because the list, it's not the best shape, but we are working on it, okay? So I think, what I'll commit is that we're gonna continue working on it. It's an iterative process, it's a big list, it's gonna take time. But there are examples, lots of CDs. Remember, when you look at a CD, look at how old that CD is. Like the newer CDs are gonna be more representative of our practice today. DOJ. Oh wait, I did want to mention as well, I'm talking about integrated planning, that we did, in terms of kind of our requirements, and this will be on the website somewhere near this integrated planning, we did send to all the Enforcement and Compliance Assurance Division directors just last week implementation of integrated planning and green infrastructure through enforcement tools. So Mike Harris from Region 5, one of our 5 assurance, ECAD division directors received this. And basically, it's just reminding all of our regions, hey, to the extent you're having discussions with the municipality on Clean Water Act issues, that community must be made aware of the opportunity to enter into an integrated plan. It talks about going forward with consent decree approvals, that our internal mechanism, the folks there have to talk about how they did engage the community on integrated planning and how they did engage the community on green infrastructure. And then, it also talks about, to the extent somebody wants to ask for a modification, there's language in the integrated plan about that. So there's a transition rule section in the integrated planning language from the Clean Water Act amendment, and so I'll just leave you to look at that, but it's pretty clear. I think it's the kind of thing that we already do in many respects, but I do want you to know that we think this is a good idea. It's a good idea to look at all your Clean Water Act requirements and bring them together. I did want to address one kind of minor thing before I move off of the integrated planning and talk about DOJ. If your community is in violation, especially if it's things like SSOs, it's hard to imagine putting that into a permit. I mean, I'm not going to say it can't be done, but we have to, I just want you to know, I don't want everyone to be leaving here going like, hey, we're all going to go to permitting. I mean, if you're in violation, there's going to be exceptions to that, okay? Especially if you have SSOs, things like that. We also have to acknowledge that this is based on the state's water quality standards. Do they allow for schedules longer than 5 years, things like that? So there are hiccups, and we have to figure it out case by case. This is mostly Ohio folks here. All right, so DOJ, I would just say, so you guys know, DOJ, it's mostly attorneys there. They do hire technical help. They have 6 sections, or maybe they have 6 associate section chiefs that I primarily work with, first line supervisors. So even though there's 10 EPA regions, there's 6 DOJ managers. Region 5 gets a manager at DOJ that only handles Region 5. Bill Brighton, who we tried to talk into coming here, he couldn't make it. Maybe because he knew you guys would all be looking at. But anyhow, I just want you to know, just like I work closely with the regions, we work closely with DOJ. We want to make sure we have national consistency. They're aware. They have this document that we sent out last week. They know that we want to include integrated planning discussions. But I think DOJ, they think about the legal side. Hey, these are up for public review. A judge has to approve it. A judge has to say it's okay. We know there's differences in judges. Where's Mayor Horgan? He left, but so there's differences out there, and so I think we try and work closely with them on the national consistency. But as far as I can tell, DOJ is very good at working with local kind of individual community issues or concerns, because every case is case specific, but it does sometimes add to the timing. So I think my office and DOJ, we're trying to balance between certainty and flexibility, but we are open to adaptive management, and we're trying to figure out how to better do that. So with that, I will step down and yield the floor to Russ.
Before I get started, I wanted to first add Region 5's thanks. First to Director Stevenson and also to Tiffany Kavalek for a wonderful conference, a wonderful workshop. I've learned a lot, and I think to have this type of communication is so important that we can share, even if it's things that are maybe not so pleasant. My name's Russ Rasmussen, and I am the Water Policy Advisor in EPA Region 5. Unlike most people from EPA that would stand up here, I have been with the agency for all of 6 months. A short enough time that I am unable to, as most EPA employees can, actually say a complete sentence entirely in acronyms. So I'm working on it, but I'm unable to do that. However, I do want to address the issue of naming. We, and in fact, I've heard several today, also have names. And as was said before, I don't think, since this is taped, can repeat those. But I also have another issue I have to be fully upfront with, and hopefully that you will give me some slack because of this. I am from Wisconsin, and so I had, even though I've only been with EPA 6 months, I've spent 27 years working for the state of Wisconsin. And the last 21 of those years, I was in the water programs for Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and literally held every single management position that you can hold in the Division of Water for the state of Wisconsin. So, Wisconsin has a little unique position in that it encompasses in its Department of Natural Resources not only environmental issues but also conservation issues. And so I had in the Division of Water, we also handle the fish for the state of Wisconsin, and it was a fascinating add-on to the experience. So what I wanted to do, and how do I move this forward? That way. My presentation is going to be very, very short. And what I wanted to focus on is the fact that Region 5 is very supportive of integrated planning and including integrated planning into consent decrees and permits. And we put our money also where our mouth is, because we have not only have me here, but I'm going to introduce several other folks from Region 5 who are also here. Mike Harris was referred to before. He is the director of our Enforcement and Compliance Assurance Division, or ECAD. I got an acronym. We also have Pat Kiefler, who's chief of in that particular division as well, and also Steve Jan, who is in our water division and is in charge of permits in our permits section. So they're here listening, they're here learning, and taking what we hear back. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about, and again very quickly, is repetitive of what folks have done, but I just wanted to reiterate how supportive we are in Region 5, contrary perhaps to popular belief. And so we think it's a great idea to have that flexibility and to be able to use adaptive management principles. It makes no other sense. How else would you approach it? To have these long-term 30-year plans that you think you're going to be omniscient and everything is going to be same, 20, 25 years out is not realistic. And so you have to have the ability to adapt, to take new technologies, to take new opportunities and take advantage of those. And as it was said before, it's just good government. And so we are very supportive of that, and we wanted to, just to reiterate that. Green infrastructure, again, very supportive. We are believers. We have drunk the green infrastructure Kool-Aid, and we like it. And it has such, again, opportunities as, and I know I'm telling you things you already know, but I just wanted to, stand up here and state that, EPA Region 5 is supportive of including green infrastructure where you can. In my previous experience, one thing I can point to is the city of Milwaukee in Wisconsin, who got through several very expensive consent decrees, over $1 billion they sent building tunnels. And we got to the end of that, and of course they still hadn't quite got there. And so we did a lot of green infrastructure as part of their next permit. And I was with the state and was actually managing that particular permit personally. So, and I bring that, and so does our regional administrator, Kathy Stepp, who was with the state of Wisconsin at the same time. Finally, and this is my last slide, that, again, incorporating this into permits and consent decrees as the law allows and as has been discussed. One thing that, to kind of address a little bit the question about why it's taking so long, I do have to say this is a new concept, and trying to get things right, and as Dr. Sawyers was saying, being deliberative and making sure that we get it right. Again, a community isn't faced with, some mistake that happened and wasn't maybe unintentional or nobody foresaw. We want to take a little time. So it's getting a little, there's a little kind of growing pains involved in some of the delays. But I do also want to say that in Region 5, we have amended several consent decrees to incorporate aspects of integrated planning. And I would say aspects. They're not, boom, here's the integrated plan. But, and again, we're looking to being more results-oriented than process-oriented. And how you achieve those results, as long as they're ethical and legal, should be the most cost-effective way to do that. And so we agree with that. And again, I promise to keep this short. And so I will turn it over to Jerry.
Good afternoon, everyone. All right, how we doing? Awesome. We're a little behind schedule. I'm going to move kind of quickly. So right up front, I want to say if anyone has questions, you want more information, please feel free to contact me or my Assistant Chief, John Bernstein, or our Loan and Grants Administrator, Katie Courtwright, who are all here today. So super excited to be here today. I'm really inspired by the leaders of the 7 local governments that spoke this morning. They exhibit just a lot of intelligence, innovation, passion, and leadership. And I think that Ohio is fortunate to have those people kind of leading the way for us. And it really is inspiring. Got me all jacked up. I couldn't wait to get up on the stage and do my thing. I'm a little bit of a infrastructure geek. And I visited the city of Lakewood earlier this year with the director, and we were taking a tour. The mayor took us around and was actually pulling manhole lids and wanted to show us an over-under sewer. And there I was on my hands and knees with my head down in the manhole and my butt up in the air, taking a picture with my iPhone. And all my Ohio EPA colleagues were laughing at me. But that's it. I've been doing this for a long time, and I guess in a way I'm kind of passionate about it too, from the funding end of it. And so I want to talk real quickly today about the State Revolving Fund, what it has to offer, how it can benefit Ohio communities. I got about 10 slides. I am going to move a little bit quickly, so please feel free to follow up with me if any of you would like more information on it. So here we go. Ohio has two state revolving funds. One is for water pollution control needs. We call that the Clean Water SRF. The other is for drinking water infrastructure needs. We call that the Water Supply Revolving Loan Account. So they go by different names. The state revolving fund concept really came out of the Clean Water Act amendments of 1987, when Congress decided to switch over from what was then called the Construction Grants Program to this new concept called the State Revolving Fund. And the idea behind the State Revolving Fund was that the federal government would give capitalization grants to the states that would deposit that money into funds and then would loan it out for a variety of purposes to these communities. So the diagram that you see there illustrates the blue oval in the middle is the fund, and it's really quite simple. The fund exists to loan money out to local communities to implement a wide variety of projects. They repay those funds back into the revolving loan fund, and so they're available to be loaned out again and again. On the left hand of that slide, you see the sources of money that can go into the fund. One of the big and very important sources is federal capitalization grants that we have been fortunate enough to receive every year since 1989. We match that with some state matching funds, and then we also have the ability to leverage the program and put leverage bond proceeds. So the important thing there is the revolving nature of the fund. It's there, and it's to be managed in perpetuity. So just focus real quickly on kind of the middle column, because we want to take a closer look at the Water Pollution Control Loan Fund. And this is just some highlights. We made our first loan from the Water Pollution Control Loan Fund 30 years ago. It was actually in September of 1989. Since that time, we've awarded funds for 2,600 projects, almost $10 billion worth of loan activity. We estimate that saved Ohio communities about $1.5 billion over that period of time. We have the obligation to model the fund and make sure that we maintain it in perpetuity. And when we have modeled the fund, the last round of that, we estimate that we can sustainably administer this fund at about $500 million a year, and that is if we got no additional federal capitalization. I believe that when we go through our most recent round of modeling, that number is actually going to go up. So this is a large infrastructure funding program. This slide here shows you kind of the annual loan awards from both of the SRF programs, both from the drinking water and the wastewater program. So the greenish figure, kind of what looks to be down on the bottom, is from our drinking water loan program. The darker blue is from the wastewater loan program. Now, the blue is larger for a number of reasons. We get larger capitalization grants into the Clean Water SRF, and it's also been around for a longer period of time. So the funds have had a longer opportunity to kind of multiply. So here's a couple of key things that you should look at. First, it's trending upward, which is great. That means that the fund is growing and it's getting larger and larger, which is important to meet Ohio's needs, especially the wet weather needs. Secondly, I'm very proud of, we're all very proud of, looking at the last 4 years that we illustrate there, from 2016 through 2019, really strong years. 2017 is the largest bar that you see there. That's huge. Where both of our SRF programs combined, when you take them together, we loaned out over $1 billion worth of funds just in a single year to Ohio communities. So we're real proud of that. We take that as a responsibility to do more and more. This is a bubble plot. I really kind of like this. I think it shows a couple of things. This shows our borrowers. And not surprisingly, a lot of the people in the room here today are some of our big borrowers. That can be a good thing. That can be a bad thing. I guess it depends on your point of view. but certainly the City of Columbus, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, City of Akron, Metropolitan Sewer District, City of Toledo, Euclid, all big borrowers, all are meeting wet weather needs, and a lot of that borrowing was a direct result of trying to meet those wet weather needs. So, between some of those larger bubbles, you're really looking at what probably amounts to half of the volume, the total volume of the Water Pollution Control Loan Fund have gone to wet weather communities. I've got another slide on that. Big points. I'm really proud of the fact that loan funds have gone to 547 entities across Ohio. That's more than 50% of the local governments that Ohio has, and 9.8 billion. A lot of people get drawn to those big circles, but what's really important is a lot of those little circles. Those represent much smaller forms of government, and the loan funds that they got from us were really critical to them moving ahead. This picture is really good. Tiffany, at the beginning of the day, had a picture that illustrated the wet weather communities. This is similar, but it shows the wet weather communities that have borrowed funds through the Water Pollution Control Loan Fund. And we've got it broken down in a couple of different ways. Obviously, the size of the dot represents the volume of the loans that folks have borrowed from the Water Pollution Control Loan Fund. But you'll see there the western basin of Lake Erie, through all of those combined sewer overflow communities, has borrowed about 1.18, if my eyes can see it right, 1.18 billion. Kind of the eastern part of the Lake Erie Basin is about 2.73 billion, and then all of the Ohio River Basin is about 2.79. I've got it in my notes here. If you add all of those three up, it's about $6.6 billion out of the total 9.8 that we've awarded. So 68% of the total funds awarded since the beginning of the program have been awarded to wet weather communities. So it just shows not just the strength of the Water Pollution Control Loan Fund, but the needs of the wet weather communities. They're enormous. What I did here. We're back on. Okay. In the last couple of years, we have tried to develop some special mechanisms to help out wet weather communities even more, and we really focused in on three main things. One was we created a special discount for combined sewer overflow communities, where we offered $300 million at a 0% interest rate during a 3-year window from 2017 through 2019. To try to provide some discounted funds, super discounted funds, as I like to say. Secondly, and we began this back in 2014, is we began to offer extended term financing, as Andrew alluded to. First, we got permission to offer a 30-year term, and then we followed that up a couple years later with a 45-year financing. And then thirdly, we created a mechanism that we call structured repayments, whereby communities that have a lot of debt in the near couple of years can kind of smooth that debt out by loading some of their repayments into the latter years of their repayment back into the loan program. So these three things combined are the ways that we took our loan program and tried to develop some mechanisms to try to make it a little bit more attractive and to try to help with local communities' affordability issues. I developed this slide just to kind of illustrate some of the activity that we've had with our extended term financing just since we have been offering it beginning in 2015. And really what it shows, there's a lot of numbers there, but just look at the bottom. Since we began offering extended term financing, we've loaned out about $1.2 billion with a 30-year term, which we previously didn't have, and about $169 million in a 45-year term. So communities are taking advantage of this. Combined, it's about $1.4 billion of the $3.2 billion that we have awarded in that 5-year period of time. 43% of the loan funds awarded have been awarded with an extended term. So that just shows the demand is there and communities are taking advantage of it. So this session is to try to provide some perspectives, and I just wanted to throw a couple of notes in there from the perspective of the SRF program. I can't emphasize enough that, while the Water Pollution Control Loan Fund is large and we think that it can really help out local communities, the local governments really do all the work. They're the ones who plan these projects, design these projects, put them out to bid, actually construct them. Local government is where it's all done. And our position is to try to support what local governments are doing. I mean, my hat is off to the work that local governments do. It should be recognized, I think we all do, that there's a finite capacity that local governments have for debt. You just cannot just keep adding and adding and adding to the things that local governments have to pay for. And so I think we're all in this room to try to figure out, how to build a better mousetrap. How do we get all the objectives that we're aiming for and still try to keep things affordable? I mean, if it was easy, we wouldn't be here. This is hard. It's hard work. It's rolled up sleeves work, and you're all to be commended to be here. In that you're trying to face this and try to work our way through it. So affordability, I think we all know, is a huge issue. And I'm really looking forward to the panel that's going to follow and gather some good ideas. My personal opinion is that I think we have to rethink kind of the whole framework of affordability completely. We need to rethink it in almost any manner, from even right down to residential, and programs to help residents pay. I think both state and federal government have to kind of rethink some of these ideas that we have about affordability. So it's something we're all going to have to work on. Affordability and ability to repay, to me, are not exactly the same thing. I think we use those terms synonymously, but they're slightly different. And we need to be able to recognize the difference between those two. That being said, the Water Pollution Control Loan Fund and Ohio EPA are committed to support wet weather communities. We're here, we're trying to manage our funds so that it can do the most for Ohio communities and to help you, achieve your objectives. So I'm going to wrap it up right there. I know we're a little bit behind. I would love to talk with all of you after this session or after today. Thank you very much.